The silence of a night shift can drive a man insane. But at Willow Oaks Apartments, it's the sounds you hear that will destroy your sanity forever. My name is Marcus Webb, and I've been a night security guard at Willow Oaks Apartments in Louisville, Kentucky, for exactly 3 weeks now. 3 weeks that have aged me 3 decades. When I first took this job, I thought it would be easy money. Just sit in a booth, watch some monitors, maybe do a few rounds. The pay was surprisingly good for what seemed like simple work, but now I understand why the turnover rate is so high. On my first night, Mrs. Chun, the property manager, handed me a laminated sheet of paper along with my security badge and keys. "These are the rules," she said, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she passed the document to me. "Follow them exactly, no exceptions. The safety of our tenants depends on it." I glanced at the paper, expecting typical security protocols about locking doors and checking IDs. Instead, I found something far more disturbing. Willow Oaks Apartments, night security protocols. 1. Never acknowledge the woman in the white dress who walks the third-floor hallway between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. She is not a tenant. 2. If you hear children laughing in apartment 4B after midnight, do not investigate. The apartment has been vacant for 6 months. 3. The elevator will sometimes stop on the 5th floor on its own. Do not get off. Press the ground floor button and wait for it to descend. 4. If a tenant calls complaining about water dripping from their ceiling, check the apartment above first. If that apartment is empty, hang up immediately and do not respond to further calls from that unit. 5. Never enter the basement after 1 a.m., regardless of what the security monitors show happening down there. 6. If you see a man in a brown coat standing in the parking lot staring at the building, turn off all lobby lights and wait in your security office until he leaves. 7. Should you encounter Mrs. Morrison from apartment 2 wandering the halls, gently escort her back to her unit. Mrs. Morrison died in 2019, but she doesn't know this yet. 8. The security cameras in the east stairwell will sometimes show events from the past. These recordings are not malfunctions. Document what you see, but do not attempt to interfere. 9. If all the lights in the building flicker simultaneously at exactly 3:17 a.m., evacuate immediately and do not return until sunrise. 10. Trust the rules. They exist because previous guards learned these lessons the hard way. At the bottom, in red ink, someone had scrawled, "The building chooses who stays and who goes. Be respectful." I laughed nervously, assuming it was some kind of hazing ritual for new employees. "Very funny," I told Mrs. Chun. "Where are the real security protocols?" Her expression didn't change. "Those are the real protocols, Marcus. Follow them, and you'll keep yourself and the tenants safe. Ignore them." She trailed off, staring past me toward the darkened hallway beyond the lobby. Let's just say we've had to replace several guards this year. The first few nights passed without incident, though I kept the laminated sheet close by, reading it whenever the building grew too quiet. Willow Oaks was a converted Victorian mansion, built in 1892 and transformed into apartments in the 1960s. The building retained much of its original architecture, ornate moldings, hardwood floors, and tall windows that seemed to watch you as you moved through the halls. The lobby where I stationed myself was spacious but dimly lit, with a grand staircase that curved upward in shadows. My security desk sat beneath a massive crystal chandelier that occasionally swayed without any apparent cause. The building housed 42 units across 5 floors, and during my first week, Everything seemed normal. Tenants came and went. I checked IDs, signed for late deliveries, and monitored the security cameras showing empty hallways and stairwells. But on my 8th night, the rules began to make sense. At 2:17 a.m., movement on the 3rd floor camera caught my attention. A woman in a flowing white dress walked slowly down the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floors. Her long dark hair obscured her face, and something about her movement seemed wrong. Too fluid, too graceful, as if she were gliding rather than walking. I checked the tenant roster. No one on the 3rd floor matched that description. My first instinct was to investigate, but rule number 1 echoed in my mind. Never acknowledge the woman in the white dress who walks the 3rd floor hallway between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. I forced myself to look away from the monitor, my hands shaking as I gripped the edge of my desk. When I finally looked back 10 minutes later, the hallway was empty. I made a note in my log. 2:17 a.m. to 2:27 a.m. 3rd floor, no disturbances. It felt like lying, but somehow, it also felt necessary. The next night brought a new horror. At 12:43 a.m., the sound of children's laughter echoed through the building's intercom system. High-pitched giggles and the sound of small feet running across hardwood floors filled the lobby. I checked the monitors frantically, searching for the source. The laughter seemed to be coming from apartment 4B on the 4th floor. I pulled up the tenant information on my computer. According to the records, 4B had been vacant since the previous tenant, a young mother named Sarah Williams, had moved out abruptly in March. The apartment had remained empty despite the building's high occupancy rate. The laughter continued, growing louder and more frenzied. It sounded like at least 3 children, maybe more, playing some kind of game. I reached for my radio to call Mrs. Chun, but rule number 2 stopped me cold. If you hear children laughing in apartment 4B after midnight, do not investigate. I sat in my chair, paralyzed, as the phantom children played their invisible games. The laughter went on for nearly an hour before finally fading away, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt oppressive. By the end of my 2nd week, I had witnessed every phenomenon listed in the rules at least once. The elevator's mysterious stops on the 5th floor, the basement cameras showing shadowy figures moving in the sublevel corridors, the man in the brown coat who appeared in the parking lot every few nights like clockwork. But it was Mrs. Morrison who truly convinced me that Willow Oaks Apartments was more than just an old building with quirky residents. On my 14th night, I encountered her for the first time. I was doing my 1 a.m. rounds when I saw an elderly woman in a floral nightgown wandering the 2nd floor hallway. She moved slowly, her slippered feet shuffling across the floor as she peered at apartment doors, as if looking for something. "Ma'am," I called out gently, "are you okay?" She turned toward me, and my blood ran cold. Her face was pale and translucent, her eyes clouded with confusion. "I can't find my key," she said, her voice carrying an odd echo. "I know I put it somewhere, but I can't remember where." According to rule number 7, I was supposed to escort her back to apartment 2A. As we walked, she chattered about her cat, Mr. Whiskers, and how she needed to get back to feed him. She mentioned her daughter visiting next week and her plans to bake cookies for the neighbors. When we reached apartment 2A, I expected to find it occupied, perhaps by a family member caring for this clearly confused elderly woman. Instead, the door bore an eviction notice dated 6 months ago. Through the window beside the door, I could see the apartment was completely empty. "Here you are, Mrs. Morrison," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, dear," she replied, walking through the closed door as if it weren't there. "Such a nice young man. Mr. Whiskers will like you." I stood in the hallway for several minutes, staring at the empty apartment, before finally returning to my post. When I looked up Mrs. Morrison's records later, I found exactly what I feared. Margaret Morrison, age 78, had died of natural causes in apartment 2A on October 15th, 2019. The apartment had remained vacant since then, despite numerous attempts to rent it. Now, 3 weeks into this job, I understand why the previous guards left. Willow Oaks Apartments isn't just home to the living. The building itself seems to be a repository for memories, emotions, and souls that refuse to let go. The rules aren't just guidelines. They're a survival manual for navigating a world where the dead and living coexist in a delicate balance. Tonight marks my 21st shift, and as I sit here in the lobby, I can already feel the familiar tension building in the air. The grandfather clock in the corner shows 11:47 p.m., and soon, the building will come alive with its supernatural residents. I've learned to respect them, to follow the rules, and to understand that my role isn't just to protect the living tenants. It's to maintain the peace between two worlds that overlap within these Victorian walls. The rules keep everyone safe, both the living and the dead. And I'm beginning to realize that breaking them doesn't just endanger the tenants. It threatens the very fabric that holds this impossible coexistence together. The 21st night at Willow Oaks started like any other, but I should have known it would be different when I found the additional note tucked under my security badge. Written in the same shaky handwriting that had added the warning at the bottom of the original rules, it read, "Marcus, the building is testing you tonight. Stay strong. JR." I had no idea who JR was, but something about the note filled me with dread. As I settled into my desk chair and began my routine checks of the security monitors, I noticed several anomalies that hadn't appeared before. The timestamp on the east stairwell camera was flickering between the current time and dates from months, sometimes years ago. The basement cameras showed a strange fog creeping along the corridors, despite the building's climate control maintaining perfect conditions. At 11:58 p.m., Mrs. Patterson from apartment 3C called the security desk. Her voice was strained with panic as she spoke. "There's water dripping from my ceiling again. It's getting worse, and I can hear footsteps upstairs, but I know for C has been empty for weeks." Rule number 4 flashed in my mind. If a tenant calls complaining about water dripping from their ceiling, check the apartment above first. If that apartment is empty, hang up immediately and do not respond to further calls from that unit. I pulled up the tenant records on my computer. My hands grew cold as I read the screen. Apartment 4C had indeed been vacant since early September when the previous tenant, David Chun, no relation to the property manager, had been found dead in his bathroom after what the coroner ruled accidental drowning in his bathtub. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to hang up now," I said, my voice barely steady. "Wait, what? Why would you?" The line went dead as I disconnected the call. Within minutes, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed apartment 3C. I let it ring. It rang again and again. Each time, I fought the urge to answer, to help a frightened tenant who was probably watching water stain her ceiling while mysterious footsteps echoed above her head. But the rules were clear, and I had learned to trust them completely. The calls from 3C continued for nearly an hour before finally stopping. During that time, I watched the fourth floor camera feed. hoping to catch some explanation for what Mrs. Patterson was experiencing. The hallway remained empty, but apartment 4C's door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been closed during my earlier rounds. At 1:15 a.m., something unprecedented happened. All 10 lines on my security desk phone rang simultaneously. The cacophony of electronic chirping filled the lobby, echoing off the high ceiling and crystal chandelier. I stared at the phone system in horror, watching as caller IDs flashed across the display faster than I could read them. Some showed apartment numbers, others displayed names I recognized from the tenant roster, and a few showed numbers that didn't correspond to any unit in the building. The ringing stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence so profound that I could hear my own heartbeat. That's when I noticed the elevator moving on its own, climbing from the ground floor to the second, then the third, fourth, and finally stopping at the fifth floor, exactly as rule number 3 had warned me it would. But tonight was different. Tonight, the elevator doors opened on the fifth floor and stayed open. Through the security camera mounted inside the elevator, I could see into the fifth floor hallway. What I saw made my blood freeze. The hallway was packed with people, men, women, children, all standing perfectly still, all staring directly at the elevator camera. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their clothes spanning decades of fashion from Victorian dresses to 1980s business suits to modern casual wear. Among them, I recognized several faces. Mrs. Morrison stood near the front, her floral nightgown pristine despite her years of death. Behind her, I spotted David Chun, his hair still damp as if he had just stepped out of his fatal bath. The woman in the white dress from the third floor stood at the very back, her face finally visible, and it was beautiful and terrible, with eyes that held infinite sadness. They all watched the camera, watched me through the electronic eye, and I realized with growing horror that they were waiting for something, or someone. The elevator began to descend. Fourth floor, third floor, second floor. I grabbed my radio and called Mrs. Chin's emergency line, but got only static. My cell phone showed no signal despite having full bars moments earlier. The building's landline was dead. Ground floor. The elevator doors opened into the lobby, and the impossible crowd of deceased residents began to file out. They moved in perfect silence, their feet making no sound on the marble floor. Mrs. Morrison nodded to me politely as she passed my desk, as if this were a perfectly normal evening stroll. David Chin avoided eye contact, shame evident in his posture. The woman in the white dress was the last to emerge, and she stopped directly in front of my security station. "You've been respectful," she said, her voice carrying the echo of wind through empty rooms. "But respect isn't enough anymore. The building is changing, and the rules may not protect you much longer." "What do you mean?" I whispered, surprised that my voice worked at all. She tilted her head, studying me with those infinitely sad eyes. "Someone broke the rules. Someone let something in that shouldn't be here. Now we're all in danger, the living and the dead alike." Before I could respond, she and the other apparitions simply faded away, leaving me alone in the lobby with only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock and the hum of the building's electrical systems. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the security footage from the past 3 weeks, searching for any clue about who might have broken the rules and what they might have unleashed. What I found in the recordings chill me to the bone. On my 5th night, during the 3 a.m. hour when I had briefly dozed off, the camera showed a man in a maintenance uniform entering the basement. He carried a crowbar and a flashlight, and he moved with purpose toward a section of the basement that the cameras couldn't cover due to a blind spot. He emerged 40 minutes later, but something was different about him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, and his face bore an expression of confusion and fear. I recognized him as Tom Bradley, one of the day shift maintenance workers. But according to the work schedules, Tom hadn't been in the building that night. More disturbing still, when I cross-referenced the timestamp with news reports, I discovered that Tom Bradley had died in a car accident 2 nights before the footage was recorded. The recordings from subsequent nights showed increasing supernatural activity. The phantom children in apartment 4B appeared more frequently and for longer periods. The man in the brown coat no longer waited in the parking lot. He had begun approaching the building. Mrs. Morrison wandered the halls more often, sometimes appearing on multiple floors simultaneously. And new spirits had begun manifesting, faces I didn't recognize from the tenant records, some dating back decades based on their clothing and hairstyles. But most troubling of all was what I found in the basement footage from just 3 nights ago. During the prohibited hours after 1 a.m., the camera showed something moving in the shadows, something that wasn't human, wasn't a ghost, but something else entirely. It moved like liquid darkness, flowing along the walls and ceiling, consuming light wherever it touched. As dawn broke over Louisville and my shift came to an end, I sat in my car in the parking lot, staring up at the Victorian windows of Willow Oaks Apartments. In the morning light, it looked like any other converted historic building. Charming, well-maintained, respectable. But I now knew that appearances could be deceiving. Whatever Tom Bradley had released from the basement was spreading through the building like an infection, disturbing the careful balance that had existed between the living and the dead. The rules that had protected everyone for years were beginning to fail, and the supernatural residents were growing restless and frightened. I thought about quitting, about walking away, and never looking back. But the woman in the white dress had said something that haunted me. Now we're all in danger, the living and the dead alike. If I abandoned my post, who would protect the living tenants from whatever was coming? Who would maintain what remained of the peace between worlds? As I drove home through the quiet morning streets, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I would stay. I would find a way to fix whatever Tom Bradley had broken. I would protect Willow Oaks Apartments and everyone who called a home, whether they drew breath or not. But first, I needed to find out who JR was and learn everything I could about what was hidden in that basement. The rules had kept everyone safe for years, but now I have to write new ones. Rules for surviving something that even the dead feared. The building was changing, and so was I. The answer to JR's identity came from the most unexpected source, Mrs. Chen herself. When I arrived for my 22nd shift, I found her waiting in the lobby with a cardboard box and a haunted expression that made her look decades older than her 60-something years. "I heard what happened last night," she said without preamble. "Mrs. Patterson called me this morning, crying about water damage and phone calls that no one would answer. She's moving out by the end of the week." I started to apologize, but she held up her hand to stop me. "You did exactly what you were supposed to do, Marcus. The rules exist for a reason, and you followed them perfectly." She set the car box on my security desk. "But it's time you knew the whole truth about Willow Oaks, and about the man who wrote those rules." Inside the box were dozens of security logs dating back 15 years, along with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten journals. The name on most of the documents was James Richardson, Jr. Jimmy was the night security guard here for 12 years. Mrs. Chen explained, settling into the visitor's chair across from my desk. He started when he was just 22, fresh out of college with a degree in criminal justice. Like you, he thought this would be easy money while he looked for a real job in law enforcement. She pulled out a photograph from 2010 showing a young man with sandy hair and kind eyes standing in front of the Willow Oaks main entrance. He looked so normal, so alive with hope and ambition. The building changed him, Mrs. Chun continued. At first, he was just like any other guard. He'd do his rounds, check the monitors, handle the occasional noise complaint. But Willow Oaks has always had its peculiarities. Jimmy began noticing things, patterns in the disturbances, behaviors that didn't make sense unless you understood what was really happening here. I opened one of the earlier journals, dated 2011. Jimmy's handwriting was neat and professional as he documented strange occurrences. Elderly woman seen on second floor, claims to be Mrs. Morrison, but apartment 2A is vacant according to management. Elevator stops on 5th floor repeatedly despite no service calls. Basement motion detectors triggered nightly between 1 to 4 a.m., but cameras show nothing. He was creating the rules. I realized, flipping through pages of meticulous observations and gradually developing protocols. Mrs. Chin nodded grimly. Each rule cost him something. Every supernatural encounter he documented. Every ghost he learned to avoid or appease. Every mysterious phenomenon he cataloged. It all took a piece of his sanity, his humanity. But he kept going because he understood something that most people never grasp. The dead deserve respect and protection just as much as the living. I found a journal entry from 2015 that made my hands tremble. The basement is the key to everything. Something powerful was sealed down there decades ago. Something that feeds on death and fear. The building's supernatural residents aren't haunting Willow Oaks. They're guarding it. They're keeping whatever's down there contained. What happened to him? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Mrs. Chun was quiet for a long moment, staring at the crystal chandelier above us. 3 years ago, we had a maintenance issue in the basement. A pipe burst during a winter freeze, and water was flooding the sub-basement levels. Jimmy warned me not to send anyone down there after 1 a.m., but the emergency couldn't wait until morning. She pulled out a police report dated February 14th, 2022. Tom Bradley volunteered for the overtime. He was a good worker, reliable, had a family to support. Jimmy tried to stop him, even offered to go down himself, but Tom insisted. He said he knew the basement plumbing better than anyone. The report detailed how Tom Bradley had been found the next morning in the sub-basement, catatonic and unresponsive. He was hospitalized for 3 weeks with what doctors called a complete psychotic break. When he finally began speaking again, he claimed to have no memory of what happened in the basement, but his personality had completely changed. He became paranoid, aggressive, and obsessed with returning to Willow Oaks. And Jimmy? I prompted. Jimmy blamed himself. He said he should have physically stopped Tom, should have found another way to handle the emergency. He became increasingly isolated, spending more time researching the building's history, trying to understand what Tom had encountered down there. Mrs. Chun handed me the final journal, dated just 6 months ago. The handwriting was shaky now, less controlled. I found the original blueprints in the city archives. Willow Oaks wasn't just converted from a mansion. It was built on top of something older. The basement extends much deeper than our current layout shows. There are rooms down there that were sealed off during the 1960s renovation, rooms that the construction crew refused to talk about. The journal entries became increasingly erratic. documenting Jimmy's growing obsession with accessing the sealed sections of the basement. He'd researched the building's previous owners, tracked down surviving construction workers from the renovation, even consulted with paranormal researchers and historians. He found something, I said, reading Jimmy's final entries. He discovered what was sealed down there. Yes, Mrs. Chin whispered, and it cost him everything. The last entry was dated 6 months ago, the night Jimmy Richardson disappeared. I know how to get into the sealed basement. The entrance is hidden behind the water heater in the northeast corner. Tom Bradley found it during the flood repair, but he went in unprepared. I won't make the same mistake. If I don't come back, follow the rules. Keep everyone safe. The Guardians will protect you as long as you respect them. They found his body 3 days later, Mrs. Chen said, her voice barely audible, at the bottom of Willow Creek, 5 miles from here. The coroner said he drowned, but Jimmy was an excellent swimmer. The police ruled it suicide, said the stress of his job had finally broken him. But you don't believe that. She shook her head. I think Jimmy found what he was looking for in that basement, and it followed him out. I think he led it away from the building on purpose, sacrificing himself to protect everyone else. I spent the next hour reviewing Jimmy's research, piecing together the horrifying truth about Willow Oaks Apartments. The building sat on land that had been a burial ground for both Native Americans and early settlers. The original Victorian mansion had been built by Cornelius Willow in 1892, a wealthy industrialist who had dabbled in spiritualism and occult practices. According to Jimmy's research, Willow had attempted to communicate with his deceased wife through seances and ritual magic. But instead of contacting his beloved Margaret, he had awakened something far more malevolent, an entity that fed on death and despair, something that had been dormant in the burial ground for centuries. The entity had grown stronger throughout the 1890s and early 1900s, feeding on the grief and loss that seemed to follow the Willow family. Multiple deaths occurred in the mansion. Servants who died in accidents, visitors who took ill and never recovered. Even Cornelius himself, found dead in the basement in 1908 under mysterious circumstances. When the mansion was converted to apartments in the 1960s, the construction crew had discovered evidence of Cornelius's occult practices in the basement. Ritual circles, bizarre symbols carved into the stone foundation, and a sealed chamber that none of the workers would enter. Instead of investigating further, they had simply walled off the entire section, burying whatever secrets lay within. But Tom Bradley had found the way in during his emergency repair work 3 years ago. He had broken the seals that had contained the entity for over 60 years, and now was free to influence the building once again. The spirits you see, Mrs. Chen explained, Mrs. Morrison, David Chun, the woman in white, they're not haunting Willow Oaks. They're protecting it. They're trying to keep that thing contained, but their power is limited. They can maintain the balance as long as the living residents follow the rules and show proper respect. But now that balance is breaking down, I said, remembering the fear in the woman in white's eyes. Exactly. The entity is growing stronger, feeding off the fear and confusion it creates. More spirits are being drawn to the building, not to haunt it, but to help guard against something far worse. And if it ever breaks free completely. She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood now why Jimmy had spent 12 years of his life creating those rules, why he had sacrificed his sanity and ultimately his life to protect Willow Oaks. The 10 rules weren't just guidelines for dealing with ghosts. They were a containment protocol for something that could threaten far more than just the residents of one apartment building. As my 22nd shift began in earnest, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 3 weeks ago. I was going into that basement. Not tonight. I needed to prepare, to research, to understand exactly what I was facing. But soon, the Guardians had chosen to trust me with their secret, and Jimmy Richardson had left me the tools I needed to finish what he had started. Whatever was sealed in that basement had been contained once before, and I would find a way to contain it again. The rules had protected everyone for 3 years since Tom Bradley's intrusion, but they were failing now. It was time for new rules and new solutions. The dead were counting on me, and so were the living. 3 days of preparation followed my conversation with Mrs. Chun. I spent every available moment studying Jimmy Richardson's research, cross-referencing historical records, and consulting with experts who specialized in what polite society preferred to dismiss as folklore. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a professor of comparative religion at the University of Louisville, proved invaluable in helping me understand the symbols and rituals that Jimmy had documented from Cornelius Willow's basement chamber. "What you're describing sounds like a binding ritual gone wrong," she explained during our phone conversation. Cornelius was attempting to create a permanent bridge between the world of the living and the dead. But instead of controlling the connection, he became a conduit for something much more dangerous. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. "Marcus, I have to ask, are you absolutely certain you want to attempt this? From what you've described, Jimmy Richardson was far more experienced than you. And he succeeded." I interrupted. For 3 years after Tom Bradley's intrusion, the rules held. The entity was contained. Jimmy's sacrifice bought us time, but now that time is running out. The truth was evident in every shift I worked. The supernatural activity was escalating rapidly. Mrs. Morrison now appeared every night, sometimes multiple times, and her confusion was growing worse. The phantom children in apartment 4B had begun crying instead of laughing, their sobs echoing through the building's ventilation system. The woman in the white dress no longer confined herself to the 3rd floor. I had seen her on every level, always watching, always waiting. Most disturbing of all was the basement footage. The dark entity that Jimmy had documented was no longer content to hide in shadows. It had begun manifesting more solidly, and I could see its influence spreading through the building like an infection. Lights flickered more frequently, electronic equipment malfunctioned, and the temperature dropped noticeably whenever it drew near. On my 25th night, I finally made my descent. I had assembled everything Jimmy's research suggested I would need. Blessed salt from 3 different religious traditions, iron nails that had been forged by hand, mirrors of various sizes and compositions, and a collection of protective symbols drawn from multiple spiritual practices. Dr. Blackwood had insisted I also carry recording equipment, both audio and video, in case I didn't survive to share what I discovered. The building felt different as I prepared for my journey into the basement. The usual supernatural activity had ceased entirely. No phantom footsteps, no crying children, no elevator movements. Even Mrs. Morrison was nowhere to be seen. It was as if the guardian spirits were holding their breath, waiting to see whether I would succeed or become another casualty in their long war against the darkness below. At exactly 1 a.m., I descended the main staircase to the basement level. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as soon as I stepped off the last stair, and my breath began to fog despite the building's climate control. The basement was a maze of utility rooms, storage areas, and mechanical spaces that hummed with the constant noise of furnaces, water heaters, and electrical systems. I found the northeast corner exactly where Jimmy's notes had indicated. The water heater was a massive industrial unit that had been installed during the building's conversion in the 1960s. Behind it, hidden in the shadows and accessible only through a narrow gap between pipes, I discovered what Tom Bradley had found 3 years ago. The wall looked normal at first glance. Standard concrete block construction, painted institutional white. But when I examined it more closely with my flashlight, I could see the subtle differences. The mortar was newer in a rectangular section about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide. Someone had walled up a doorway, and recently, that wall had been broken through and hastily repaired. I began chipping away the newer mortar with the crowbar I had brought, working as quietly as possible despite my racing heart. The concrete blocks came away easier than expected, as if they had been set in place temporarily rather than permanently sealed. Within 30 minutes, I had opened a gap large enough to crawl through. The smell that emerged from the opening was indescribable. Not decay or rot, but something far worse. It smelled like despair given physical form, like the last breath of everyone who had ever died in fear and agony. I forced myself to breathe through my mouth and squeeze through the opening into whatever lay beyond. I found myself in a corridor that definitely did not appear on any of the building's official blueprints. The walls were original stone from the 1890s, and the ceiling was barely high enough for me to stand upright. Electric lights had been installed at some point, but they flickered weakly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their light sources. The corridor stretched for about 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber. As I approached, I could hear something that made my blood freeze. Voices. Dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all whispering in unison. I couldn't make out individual words, but the collective sound was like a tide of human suffering that had been compressed into audio form. The chamber beyond was circular, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into darkness above my head. The floor was covered with an intricate pattern of symbols carved directly into the stone. Some I recognized from Jimmy's research. Others were completely alien. At the center of the room sat an ornate chair made for what appeared to be black iron, and occupying that chair was something that had once been human. Cornelius Willow sat exactly where he had died in 1908, but death had not released him from his vigil. His body was perfectly preserved, mummified by whatever forces he had unleashed in this chamber. His eyes, still bright and aware, tracked my movement as I entered his domain. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying the whispers of the dead. "I've been waiting so very long for someone to understand." I forced myself to remain calm, remembering Dr. Blackwood's warnings about entities that could manipulate human emotions. "Mr. Willow, I know what you did here. I know what you released, and I know it needs to be contained again." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with crying children. "Contained? My dear boy, I am the container. For over a century, I have served as the vessel, the prison, the guardian. Every soul that has died in this building, every spirit that has chosen to remain, they are part of me now, part of the great work." The whispering voices grew louder, and I realized they were coming from Cornelius himself. He was not possessed by the entity. He had become the entity, a collector of souls who fed on death and despair while convincing himself he was protecting the world from something worse. Jimmy Richardson understood. Cornelius continued. He saw the truth of what I had become, and he made the ultimate sacrifice to strengthen my bonds. His death in the creek was not suicide, Marcus. It was an offering, a willing surrender that bought your building 3 more years of stability. I backed toward the chamber entrance, but the opening had sealed itself. The stone wall was solid, as if the gap I had crawled through had never existed. Tom Bradley was supposed to die down here, Cornelius explained conversationally. His death would have fed me for decades, but the fool ran before I could claim him completely. He carried a piece of my essence back to the surface, and it has been growing stronger ever since. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The entity I had been tracking through the building's security cameras wasn't something that had been released from this chamber. It was a fragment of Cornelius Willow's consciousness that had attached itself to Tom Bradley during his panicked escape. And that fragment had been preparing the building, weakening the barriers, getting ready for something. Tonight, it returns to me, Cornelius said, rising from his iron throne. And you, Marcus Webb, will take Tom Bradley's place as my herald in the world above. The building needs a guardian who understands both worlds, someone who can maintain the balance while feeding me what I require. The whispers became a roar, and I realized they weren't just the voices of the dead. They were the voices of everyone who had ever tried to stop Cornelius Willow. Previous security guards, maintenance workers, even some of the building's residents who had discovered too much. All of them were trapped within him, conscious and suffering for eternity. But as I faced the mummified industrialist in his subterranean throne room, I remembered something crucial from Jimmy's research. Cornelius Willow was not invincible. He was bound to this chamber by the same forces he had tried to control, and that binding could be strengthened or broken by someone who understood the rules. I reached into my bag for the blessed salt, but Cornelius moved faster than anything dead should be able to move. His preserved hand clamped around my wrist with strength that could crush bone. No, Marcus, you don't understand yet, but you will. The chamber began to spin around me, and I felt my consciousness being pulled toward the collective whispers that surrounded Cornelius like a living shroud. This was how he had claimed Jimmy, how he had tried to claim Tom Bradley, and how he planned to claim me. But I had one advantage that the others hadn't possessed. I knew the building's guardian spirits personally, and I had earned their trust by following the rules that Jimmy Richardson had died to create. As my vision began to fade and my will started to dissolve into Cornelius Willow's collective consciousness, I heard a familiar voice cutting through the whispers. You've been respectful. Now, let us return the favor. The woman in the white dress materialized in the chamber, but she was no longer alone. Mrs. Morrison stood beside her, along with David Shunn, the Phantom children from 4B, and dozens of other spirits I had never seen before. They formed a protective circle around me, their combined will creating a barrier that even Cornelius could not immediately penetrate. You have no power here, Cornelius snarled at them. This is my domain. These are my rules. No, said Mrs. Morrison, her voice carrying an authority I had never heard before. These are Jimmy's rules now, and Marcus has proven himself worthy of our protection. The spirits began to glow with a soft, warm light that pushed back the shadows of Cornelius's chamber. For the first time in over a century, the whispers of the trapped souls began to quiet, and I felt my consciousness returning to my own control. But the battle was far from over. As I struggled to my feet, clutching the blessed salt that might be our only weapon against a creature that had been collecting souls for more than 100 years, I realized that everything I had experienced at Willow Oaks had been preparation for this moment. The rules had not just been protecting the tenants from supernatural encounters. They had been training me to face the source of all the building's mysteries. And now, surrounded by the guardian spirits who had chosen to trust me, I would either find a way to strengthen Cornelius Willow's prison forever, or die trying to prevent him from escaping into a world that was completely unprepared for his hunger. The final confrontation was about to begin. The guardian spirit's protective circle held for exactly 37 seconds before Cornelius Willow's century of accumulated power began to overwhelm them. I watched in horror as their forms started to flicker and fade, their collective will straining against an entity that had been feeding on death and despair since before most of them were even born. Touching, Cornelius sneered, his mummified features twisting into something that might have once been a smile, but ultimately futile. You cannot protect him from his destiny any more than you could protect Jimmy Richardson from his. Mrs. Morrison was the first to falter, her elderly form becoming translucent as Cornelius's influence pressed against her. "I'm sorry, Marcus," she whispered. "We're not strong enough. Not anymore." But as the guardian spirits began to fail, I finally understood what Jimmy Richardson had been trying to tell me through his research and his rules. This wasn't about defeating Cornelius Willow. It was about replacing him. For over a century, the mummified industrialist had served as a living prison, containing an even greater evil within himself, while slowly being corrupted by its influence. The original entity that he had awakened in the burial ground was still there, trapped within his consciousness along with all the souls he had collected over the decades. Cornelius wasn't the enemy. He was a failed solution that had become part of the problem. Jimmy Richardson had figured this out during his final investigation. His apparent suicide hadn't been an offering to strengthen Cornelius's bonds, as the mummified man claimed. It had been a desperate attempt to break those bonds entirely, to free all the trapped souls and force the original entity back into dormancy. But Jimmy had failed because he had tried to do it alone. What was needed wasn't a single sacrifice, but a willing replacement. Someone who could take Cornelius's place as the prison while the accumulated spiritual energy was safely dispersed. As this realization struck me, the woman in the white dress turned toward me with understanding in her infinite sad eyes. "You know what has to be done," she said. I nodded, pulling the iron nails from my bag. According to Jimmy's research, they had been forged from metal taken from the original mansion's foundation, metal that had been saturated with spiritual energy for over a century. If driven into the correct points around Cornelius's ritual circle, they would create a new binding pattern, one that required a living will to maintain it. "No," Cornelius roared, finally understanding my intent. "You don't know what you're doing. The thing that sleeps within me is older than human civilization. It feeds on entire civilizations. I'm the only thing that has kept it contained." "Maybe that was true once," I replied, moving toward the first binding point while the guardian spirit struggled to hold him back. "But you've been corrupted by it. You become part of it. The only way to truly contain it is to separate you from it entirely." I drove the first iron nail into the stone floor at the precise point where Jimmy's diagrams indicated it would disrupt Cornelius's power flow. The effect was immediate. His screams shook the entire chamber, and cracks began to appear in the walls as over a century of accumulated spiritual energy started to destabilize. The guardian spirits suddenly flared brighter as Cornelius's hold on them weakened. Mrs. Morrison solidified again, her elderly face showing grim determination. Hurry, Marcus. We can't hold a backlash for long. I moved to the second binding point, then the third, driving the hand-forged nails deep into the stone while Cornelius's form began to writhe and change. The mummified flesh was falling away, revealing something underneath that was both more and less than human. A consciousness that had been stretched across multiple dimensions for so long that it had forgotten its original shape. "You're making a mistake," he pleaded as I positioned the fourth nail. "I chose this fate to protect the world. You're young. You don't understand the responsibility, the constant vigilance required. It will drive you mad, just as it drove me." But as I drove the fourth nail home, something unexpected happened. Instead of weakening further, Cornelius began to laugh, a sound that contained genuine relief for the first time in over a century. "Oh," he whispered, his voice becoming more human as his spiritual bonds loosened. "Oh, I see. Jimmy was right. I couldn't see it because I had become part of it. But you can see the true pattern." The fifth nail completed the binding circle, and suddenly the chamber was flooded with light as a century's worth of trapped souls began to separate from Cornelius's consciousness. They rose from his dissolving form like luminous butterflies, each one pausing to acknowledge me before ascending toward whatever waited beyond this earthly prison. Among them, I saw faces I recognized from Jimmy's research, previous security guards, maintenance workers, even some of the building's former residents who had died under mysterious circumstances. They had all been trapped within Cornelius's expanded consciousness, forced to experience his century-long vigil against the ancient entity. But the entity itself remained, no longer hidden within Cornelius's form, but revealed in its true nature. A writhing mass of shadow and hunger that had indeed been old when humanity was young. It pressed against the new binding circle I had created, testing for weaknesses, searching for a way to escape now that its long-time prison had been dissolved. "Now comes the hard part," said the woman in the white dress, her form becoming more solid as Cornelius's influence over the building's spiritual residents faded completely. "Someone has to take his place. Someone has to become the new guardian." I looked at the Iron Throne where Cornelius had sat for over a century, then at the ancient entity that writhed within the binding circle. I understood now why Jimmy's rules had been so specific, so carefully crafted. He hadn't just been documenting supernatural phenomena. He had been preparing whoever came after him to make this choice with full knowledge of the consequences. "There is another way," Mrs. Morrison said quietly. "Jimmy found it in his research, but he didn't live long enough to implement it." She gestured toward the ritual symbols carved into the chamber floor. "The binding doesn't require a single guardian. It can be distributed among multiple willing spirits, each taking a portion of the burden so that no one consciousness is overwhelmed by the entity's influence." The other guardian spirits moved forward, forming a circle around the binding pattern. David Chin nodded grimly. "We're already dead. We can't be corrupted the way the living can. And together, we're strong enough to hold it. But you'll be trapped here," I protested, "just like Cornelius was." The woman in the white dress shook her head. "Not trapped, committed. There's a difference. Cornelius was alone with his burden, slowly being consumed by it. We'll share the load, and we'll have each other for support. And most importantly, we'll have you above ground, maintaining the rules that help us stay strong." I realized this had been the plan all along. The guardian spirits hadn't been protecting Willow Oaks from supernatural threats. They had been preparing for this moment, gathering the strength and numbers needed to replace Cornelius as the entity's prison. My role wasn't to sacrifice myself, but to serve as their connection to the living world, ensuring that the building's delicate balance was maintained. The rules will have to change, I said, understanding flooding through me. New protocols for new circumstances. Yes, Mrs. Morrison agreed. But the basic principle remains the same: respect for both the living and the dead, and understanding that some battles are won not through violence, but through willing sacrifice and mutual cooperation. The ancient entity let out a sound like civilizations dying as the guardian spirits took their positions around the binding circle. They joined hands, or the spiritual equivalent of hands, and began to glow with combined purpose. Slowly, carefully, they began to compress the entity back into dormancy, not through force, but through overwhelming it with positive spiritual energy. Cornelius Willow, free at last from his century-long burden, looked at me with eyes that were finally, truly human again. "Thank you," he whispered, his form beginning to fade as his long-delayed death finally claimed him. Tell them I try to do the right thing." And then he was gone, ascending toward whatever peace awaited those who had carried impossible burdens in service to others. The chamber began to collapse as the spiritual energies that had held it together for over a century were redistributed among the guardian spirits. I ran toward where the entrance had been, finding that the passage was already reforming. Behind me, I could hear the guardian spirits beginning their eternal vigil, not trapped like Cornelius had been, but united in purpose and supported by their collective will. I emerged from the basement as the sun was rising over Louisville, covered in stone dust and spiritually exhausted, but alive and free. Mrs. Chun was waiting for me in the lobby, along with a small crowd of tenants who had been awakened by the building's shaking during the spiritual transfer. "Is it over?" she asked. I looked around at the lobby, noting that the oppressive atmosphere that had clung to Willow Oaks for months was finally gone. The building felt peaceful again, but it was a different kind of peace, not the fragile balance of the past, but the solid serenity of a problem truly solved. "It's over," I confirmed, "but there will be new rules. The guardian spirits are still here, but their role has changed. They're not just protecting the living from supernatural encounters anymore. They're actively maintaining the building's spiritual health." Over the following weeks, I worked with Mrs. Chun to establish new protocols for Willow Oaks Apartments. The 10 original rules were retired with honor, replaced by a simpler set of guidelines that emphasize cooperation between the living and dead residents rather than just avoidance. Mrs. Morrison still wanders the halls, but now she helps new tenants settle in and serves as an unofficial building ambassador. The phantom children in 4B have become the building's early warning system, alerting me to any problems through changes in their play patterns. The woman in the white dress, who finally told me her name, is Margaret Willow, Cornelius's long-dead wife, serves as the coordinator for the guardian spirit's activities. And me? I'm still the night security guard at Willow Oaks Apartments, but my job description has expanded considerably. I maintain the building's spiritual equilibrium, serve as a liaison between living and dead residents, and continue Jimmy Richardson's research into supernatural phenomena, not to avoid or contain them, but to understand and work with them. 6 months later, as I sit in my security booth during another quiet night shift, I can honestly say that Willow Oaks is the safest apartment building in Louisville, protected by guardians who have chosen their watch willingly, maintained by residents who understand that death is just another way of belonging to a community, and overseen by someone who learned that the most powerful rules aren't about keeping things apart, but about bringing them together in harmony. The ancient entity sleeps peacefully in its distributed prison, held in check not by fear and isolation, but by the combined will of spirits who have found purpose in protection. And above them all, the building stands as proof that even the darkest histories can be transformed when people, living and dead alike, choose cooperation over conflict. Sometimes, late at night, I hear Jimmy Richardson's voice in the whisper of the building's ventilation system, thanking me for finishing what he started. And sometimes, just before dawn, I see Cornelius Willow standing in the lobby, finally at peace, nodding his approval before fading into the light of a new day. The rules have changed, but their purpose remains the same: keeping everyone safe, honoring the past, and building a future where death is not an ending, but simply another way to call Willow Oaks home. Some nights are quiet. Some nights bring new challenges as other supernatural entities test our defenses or lost spirits seek sanctuary within our walls. But whatever comes, we face it together, the living and the dead, united by rules that were written not in fear, but in understanding. And in apartment 4B, the children still play their fandom games, but now they're laughing again.